In the remote mountains of Alaska, far from the nearest town and surrounded by nothing but vast wilderness, a cabin stood alone, untouched by time or people for years. It was a place of escape for anyone brave enough to endure the harsh, frozen landscape. The cabin had no running water, no electricity, and only the faintest traces of previous occupants left in its dusty, dilapidated walls. But for one man, it was the perfect retreat to get away from the chaos of city life. His name was Daniel, a software engineer who had recently faced a devastating breakup and needed to get away from it all. He rented the cabin for a week, hoping the isolation would provide him with some peace. He arrived on a crisp December evening, the sun sinking behind snow-covered mountains, casting long shadows across the frozen terrain. The air was biting, the wind whispering through the skeletal trees, as if the forest itself was trying to speak. Daniel stepped into the cabin, which was as cold inside as it was outside. He lit a fire in the stone fireplace, watching as the flames grew and crackled, casting a warm glow over the wooden beams and dusty furniture. The quiet was absolute. There was no sound other than the crackle of the fire, the occasional gust of wind shaking the windows, and the soft, eerie whisper of snowflakes tapping against the glass. The first night passed without incident. The second night, however, something strange happened. As Daniel lay in bed, wrapped in the thick blankets, he heard a noise coming from outside, scratching, like nails dragging across wood. At first, he thought it was the wind or some small animals searching for food. But when the sound continued, persistent and rhythmic, his curiosity got the best of him. He grabbed his flashlight and pulled on his coat, stepping out into the biting cold of the Alaskan night. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked around the cabin, trying to locate the source of the noise. His flashlight beam swept across the snow-covered ground. But there was nothing but the endless expanse of white and the towering trees that surrounded him. But then he saw it. At the edge of the forest, standing still and motionless, was a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, draped in tattered clothing that blended seamlessly with the white snow. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He called out, but the figure didn't respond. It simply stood there unmoving, as if it were waiting for something. Fear gripped him, but the wind howled louder, urging him to step back inside. He turned and ran for the cabin, locking the door behind him. He told himself it was just his imagination, the isolation and cold playing tricks on him. But deep down, something told him that it wasn't. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat near the fire, staring into the flames, trying to shake the image of the figure from his mind. The wind continued to howl outside, and the night stretched on, thick and suffocating. The next morning, Daniel woke to find the snow outside had been disturbed. But it wasn't footprints. The figure had left something else behind. Scratches, deep gouges in the snow, as if something had been dragged across it. The marks led away from the cabin, into the dark woods beyond. Shaken, Daniel packed his things and decided to leave. He could no longer stay in the cabin, not with a strange figure lingering in the woods, waiting. He started the truck and drove away, but as he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw it, standing at the edge of the woods, watching him leave. It never moved. It simply watched. The thing in the snow had been real, and Daniel would never forget the cold emptiness in its eyes. In the heart of the Colorado Rockies lies a desolate, abandoned ski resort, long since closed due to an avalanche that wiped out much of the infrastructure and left several lives lost in the snow. The resort was once a bustling getaway, drawing tourists from all over the world to experience pristine slopes and luxurious cabins. But now it's a place of silence, where snow drifts through broken windows, and the structures stand like forgotten monuments to a past that can never be reclaimed. One late winter's evening, a group of 4 friends, Tom, Sarah, Jake, and Emily, decided to venture to the resort. They were thrill seekers, always on the lookout for abandoned places to explore, and they'd heard the stories of the resort. It was said to be haunted, a place where strange things happened, and voices echoed the halls long after the living had departed. They drove up the long, winding road that led to the resort, the snowstorm intensifying as they ascended higher into the mountains. The visibility was poor, but they pressed on, eager to reach their destination. When they arrived, they found the resort to be even more imposing than they had imagined. The buildings were decayed, the once luxurious interiors now covered in dust and webs. Snow piled up inside through broken windows, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The group wandered through the abandoned buildings, exploring the old ski lodges and checking out the rundown equipment that had once been used by the resort's patrons. They laughed and joked, unaware of the chilling presence that lingered in the corners of the resort. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply, and the wind outside howled louder. They decided to set up camp inside one of the cabins, building a fire in the fireplace to keep warm. But as the flames flickered, they began to hear noises. Strange creaks and whispers as if someone or something was moving through the walls. At first, they brushed it off as the old house settling, but the sounds grew louder. Then came the knocking, soft but insistent, coming from the other side of the cabin door. Jake, curious and a bit reckless, opened it. What he saw made his blood run cold. In the doorway stood a woman, pale and shivering, her clothes tattered and her face obscured by her long, wet hair. She seemed to be pleading, her eyes wide with desperation, but no sound came from her lips. The group stood frozen, unsure what to do. Then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished into the darkness of a snowstorm. They were terrified but confused. Who could this woman be? And why was she out there in the middle of the blizzard? Was she real? Or had the horrors of the resort finally begun to break them? The answer came when they decided to leave. As they piled into the car to head back down the mountain, they glanced in the rear-view mirror. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was the woman again, motionless, staring. But this time, something was different. She was not alone. Dozens of figures stood behind her, all of them staring blankly into the night. It was then that the truth hit them. The resort wasn't abandoned after all. The souls of those who had died in the avalanche still lingered there, trapped in a never-ending winter. In the rugged wilderness of British Columbia, a place where the dense forest seemed to swallow up the light, there are stories of hikers who wander off the beaten path, never to return. The land is unforgiving, and in winter, it becomes an inhospitable expanse of white, as frozen and unyielding as the mountains themselves. One such story is that of a young woman named Claire, a seasoned hiker. She had spent years trekking to the Canadian wilderness, but this winter would be different. Claire had planned a solo hike through the snowy mountain trails, wanting to challenge herself and find a sense of peace in the stillness of nature. What she didn't know was that the mountain was not as quiet as it seemed. Claire set off early one cold December morning, the snow already knee-deep as she began her journey. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones with every breath. The world was silent except for the crunch of her boots in the snow and the occasional distant howl of wind as it whipped through the trees. Hours passed, and Claire pressed on. But as the day wore on, the weather began to shift. The wind picked up, and the once quiet forest turned into a howling, chaotic storm. Snow began to fall in heavy, thick sheets, obscuring her path. Claire had learned to navigate in poor conditions, but as the visibility decreased, so did her confidence. She stopped to check her map and compass, only to find that her bearings were suddenly off. The landmarks she had passed were no longer where they should be. Panic started to rise in her chest. She retraced her steps, but the snow had covered everything, leaving no sign of the trail she had followed just moments before. As night began to fall, Claire's situation grew increasingly dire. The temperature plummeted, and she knew she needed to find shelter fast. She stumbled across what appeared to be an abandoned cabin, barely visible through the thick snowfall. Grateful for any refuge, she hurried inside. The door creaked on its hinges as she pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Dust covered the wooden furniture, and the air inside smelled musty and stale. Inside the cabin, Claire sat by the fire, trying to calm herself. She ate some of her emergency rations, tried to regain her strength, but the feeling of unease in the cabin grew stronger by the minute. There was something wrong with this place, an unnatural chill that made her skin crawl. As the night wore on, she could swear she heard faint whispers, as if the walls themselves were trying to speak to her. She tried to ignore it, attributing the sounds to the wind or her exhaustion, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. At around midnight, Claire's flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into complete darkness. She stood up, heart racing, and reached for the matches in her bag. But when her fingers brushed against the old, rotting wood of the cabin's walls, she froze. There, in the corner of the cabin, was a figure, a man or something resembling one, stood hunched over, staring at her with hollow, lifeless eyes. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. His body was twisted, as if he had been trapped in the cabin for years. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping drastically, as if the figure was draining all the warmth from the room. Claire backed away, but the figure didn't move. The whispers grew louder, and she could hear them clearly now, voices begging for help, voices that seemed to echo from all directions. "Get out," one of them whispered. "Leave this place." Without thinking, Claire bolted from the cabin, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran through the snow, not knowing which direction to go, only desperate to escape. But the snowstorm had worsened, and soon she couldn't see a thing. The winds howled around her, and the shadows of the trees twisted into nightmarish forms. She collapsed in the snow, the cold gnawing at her as exhaustion overcame her. In that moment, she realized the horror of the mountain was not just the cold or the snow. It was the spirits of those who had gotten lost before her. The mountain claimed them, trapped them in an eternal winter, forever lost in the snow. When Claire was found days later, her body was frozen solid, a look of sheer terror frozen on her face. The search team reported hearing faint cries for help, but they never saw anyone else in the snow. Claire had become another lost soul, another victim of the cursed mountain. It was supposed to be a quick drive through the Canadian countryside. Sarah and her boyfriend Eric had been driving home from a weekend getaway in the mountains. They were used to winter driving, but this time the roads were treacherous. The snow had been falling heavily, and the roads were slick with ice, making the trip much slower than they had anticipated. As they drove down a desolate, winding road surrounded by dense forests, a dense fog rolled in, obscuring their vision. It was well past midnight, and the only light came from their headlights, cutting through the thick white haze. The world outside their car seemed to disappear, leaving them in a suffocating void of snow and fog. Eric cursed under his breath as he struggled to keep the car on the road. "I don't like this," he muttered. "This fog is getting worse. We might need to pull over." Sarah nodded in agreement. Her nerves frayed from the eerie quiet of the night. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the tires on the ice. "Just a little longer," she said, trying to sound calm. "We're almost there." But that's when they saw it. Off to the side of the road, barely visible through the fog, was a figure standing still. It was a woman, her white dress blending with the snow, her hair flowing in the wind. She appeared to be staring directly at them, unmoving. Eric slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly as it came to a halt. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. "Who the hell is out here at this hour?" Sarah's heart raced. "We need to help her," she whispered. Against his better judgment, Eric rolled down the window slightly and called out to the figure. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she slowly raised her hand, pointing towards the woods that surrounded them. Without thinking, Eric put the car in park and opened the door. "Stay here," he told Sarah, his voice shaking. "I'll go check on her." Before Sarah could protest, Eric stepped out into the fog, walking toward the woman. But as soon as his feet hit the snow, something strange happened. The fog thickened, and the temperature dropped even further. The woman slowly turned her head to the side, and Sarah gasped as she saw the horrible truth. Her face was completely obscured, a hollow, empty void where her eyes should have been. Eric, however, didn't seem to notice. He took another step, but as soon as he did, the ground beneath him gave way. He screamed as he fell into the snow, disappearing from sight. Panicked, Sarah rushed out of the car, but by the time she reached where Eric had fallen, there was nothing there. The fog had swallowed him whole. Only the echo of his scream remained. She stood in the snow, breathless, heart pounding, as the figure of the woman slowly turned and began to walk away. Her footsteps made no sound, as if she wasn't really there at all. Sarah ran back to the car, her hands shaking as she locked the doors. She glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a brief moment, she saw Eric's face in the fog, pale, eyes wide with terror, and mouthing words she couldn't hear. The woman disappeared into the darkness, and Sarah knew then that the fog wasn't just an illusion. It was a curse, trapping lost souls in the snow forever. Part 5, The Final Warning, as the stories of the winter horror spread. So did the warnings. The cold wasn't just a physical threat. It was a reminder of the spirits that lingered in the darkness, waiting for their next victim. The snow, beautiful and serene in appearance, could hide unimaginable horrors, whispers on the wind, figures in the fog, and the cold grasp of the dead who would never let go. For those who dared venture into the winter wilderness, one thing was clear. The cold might freeze your body, but it was a terror that would freeze your soul. As the stories of the winter horrors spread, so did the warnings. The cold wasn't just a physical threat. It was a reminder of the spirits that lingered in the darkness, waiting for their next victim. The snow, beautiful and serene in appearance, could hide unimaginable horrors, whispers on the wind, figures in the fog, and the cold grasp of the dead who would never let go. For those who dared venture into the winter wilderness, one thing was clear. The cold might freeze your body, but it was a terror that would freeze your soul. In the heart of the French Alps, hidden away from the world by towering peaks and thick blankets of snow, stood an old inn, once a lively gathering place for travelers, but now abandoned and forgotten by time. The inn was famous for its warmth and hospitality in years long past. But after a horrific fire that claimed the lives of several guests and employees, it was left to decay, its doors and windows boarded up to keep the curious away. Legend had it that those who dared to venture near the inn at night could hear the sounds of laughter and the faint strains of music playing from within. But it wasn't just any music. It was a haunting melody, one that was said to have been played by the inn's pianist, a man who perished in the fire while trying to rescue others trapped inside. It was a story that drew Liam, an aspiring photographer, to the old in one bitterly cold December night. He had heard the rumors and, intrigued by the mystery, decided to explore the inn and document its eerie remains. His friends had warned him against it. Tales of the haunted inn had circulated for decades, and it wasn't wise to wander into places with such a dark history. But Liam was determined, driven by the need for a good story, and perhaps a photograph that would make his career. He parked his car at the base of the long, snow-covered path leading up to the inn, the cold wind biting at his face as he made his way toward the towering structure. The building loomed in front of him like a decaying ghost, its once sturdy frame now creaking with the weight of time. Snow had gathered on the roof, and the windows were covered in frost, but the door stood open, inviting him inside. Liam stepped over the threshold and into the dimly lit lobby. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the floors groaned beneath his weight. His flashlight flickered as he walked through the abandoned space, its beam illuminating shattered furniture, old portraits, and broken chandeliers. Everything about the inn seemed frozen in time, an eerie stillness that made it feel as though the building was holding its breath. He wandered through the inn, taking photographs of the decaying walls and forgotten rooms. But as the minutes passed, an unsettling feeling began to crawl up his spine. He couldn't shake the sense that he was being watched. The silence seemed oppressive, as if something or someone was lingering just beyond his sight. Then it happened. From somewhere deep within the inn, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a piano, soft and mournful, filling the air with a haunting melody. Liam froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The music was distant at first, but it was unmistakable. It was as though the piano was being played by invisible hands, drifting through the halls of the inn, beckoning him closer. He followed the sound, moving slowly through the inn, each step echoing in the silence. As he approached the ballroom, the music grew louder, more distinct, but there was no sign of the pianist. The grand piano sat in the center of the room, its keys moving as though played by an unseen hand, the haunting melody filling the air. Liam stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. The light from his flashlight illuminated the piano, but there was no one sitting at it. The keys moved, pressed down by an invisible force. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping dramatically, and Liam felt the air grow thick with a sense of foreboding. Suddenly, the music stopped. Liam stood frozen in the middle of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He was about to turn and leave when he saw something out of the corner of his eye. A figure, standing in the doorway of the ballroom. A man, dressed in a dark suit, with pale, almost translucent skin and a sad, empty expression on his face. His eyes were hollow, his mouth twisted in a grimace of pain, as though he had suffered some great loss. The figure slowly raised a hand, pointing directly at Liam. It was then that Liam saw it. The man's fingers were stained with ash, and his clothes were singed, as though he had been caught in the flames of the fire that had destroyed the inn. The ghostly figure moved toward him, his footsteps silent on the cold floor, and the air around him grew colder still. Liam tried to back away, but his legs felt like lead. He couldn't move. The man continued to approach, his hollow eyes fixed on Liam. As the ghost reached out to touch him, Liam's flashlight flickered one final time, casting a brief glimpse of the piano. The keys had stopped moving, but in that moment, Liam swore he saw a faint outline of a woman's hand resting on the piano's keys. And then, everything went dark. When Liam's friends found him days later, he was still inside the inn, standing frozen in the ballroom, his eyes wide with terror. The flashlight lay on the floor beside him. Its beam pointed toward the grand piano. The music had stopped, but the chilling air still lingered, as though the ghost of the inn had claimed another soul. Far away in the Norwegian wilderness, there's a remote stretch of road that cuts through the frozen landscape, winding its way between steep cliffs and dark forests. It's a place that few travelers venture through, especially in the dead of winter when the snow piles high and the roads become treacherous. But for one man, this road was nothing more than a shortcut, an easy path to the mountains that would take him home before the storm arrived. His name was Marcus, and he'd been driving for hours, the storm growing stronger with each passing mile. The wind howled outside his car, and snowflakes danced wildly in the headlights. The road ahead was barely visible, and the world outside had turned to an endless blur of white. As he rounded a sharp bend in the road, Marcus saw something that made him slam on the brakes. A car, abandoned on the side of the road, its doors wide open. The vehicle was covered in snow, and there was no sign of the driver. The headlights were still on, casting an eerie glow over the snow-covered ground. Marcus hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to stop. But something about the scene felt wrong, almost too strange to ignore. He pulled over, parking behind the abandoned car. He grabbed his phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The storm had wiped out any chance of communication. Reluctantly, Marcus got out of his car and approached the abandoned vehicle. The cold bit his skin, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As he approached the driver's side door, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The seat was wet, as though someone had recently been sitting there. Then, without warning, the sound of footsteps in the snow behind him made Marcus spin around. But there was no one there. His heart raced. He glanced back at the car. The driver's seat was empty. Suddenly, the engine of the abandoned car roared to life. Marcus spun around, his eyes wide with panic. The car's headlights flickered on, blinding him momentarily. The engine revved, but there was no one in the car. The vehicle started moving, slowly at first, then picking up speed as though driven by some unseen force. Terrified, Marcus stumbled backward, slipping on the snow. He reached for his phone once again, but it slipped from his hand, vanishing into the snow. He turned to run, but before he could get far, he heard something, a voice, faint at first, then growing louder. "Help me?" It wasn't the voice of a person. It was the voice of someone who had been lost to the cold. The snow continued to fall heavily as Marcus watched in horror. The car sped off into the storm, disappearing into the white abyss, and in the distance, he swore he saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, waiting. It was the driver, but the driver was already gone, trapped forever in the frozen night. There's an old legend whispered by the few remaining locals who live near the northernmost reaches of Alaska, where the night stretches on for weeks and the winds are as relentless as the cold. The legend speaks of a cabin, hidden deep in the mountains, lost to time and forgotten by all but the most desperate of travelers. They say that the cabin was once a haven, a place of warmth and safety for those caught in the unforgiving winter storms. But no one who stayed there ever came back the same. Some say they left in the dead of night, their minds shattered by an unimaginable terror. Others claimed that the spirits of the dead wander the halls, dragging the living into their icy grip. The truth, however, was far darker than anyone could have ever imagined. Samantha had heard the stories, of course, but they were nothing more than folklore to her, fanciful tales meant to keep the curious at bay. She was a seasoned survivalist, well prepared for the harshest conditions the Alaskan wilderness could throw at her. Her mission was simple: get through the mountains before the first big snowstorm of the season hit. She had a map, provisions, and the will to survive. The cabin was just a rumor, after all, and surely something so far off the beaten path would be nothing but an old shack long forgotten. But on the fourth day of her trek, with the storm already beginning to rage and her compass no longer accurate in the blinding snow, Samantha found herself facing an unexpected decision. She had lost the trail, and with the storm intensifying, she needed shelter fast. She remembered hearing one of the locals mention the cabin in passing, but she had dismissed it at the time. Now, with the snow thickening around her, the thought of shelter seemed like her only option. As she made her way toward the spot marked on her map, the wind howled fiercely, biting at her skin. Her steps were sluggish, her body exhausted from days of navigating the wilderness. The trees around her creaked and groaned, their branches sagging under the weight of the snow. There was no sign of life, no sound except for the ever-present wind. But despite the isolation, something about the silence felt wrong. After what felt like an eternity, Samantha spotted it, an old, dilapidated cabin in the distance, half buried under the snow and hidden by the towering trees. It stood in eerie stillness, as if waiting for her arrival. Without a second thought, she made her way toward it, pushing through the deep snow until she reached the door. The wood was old and weathered, but the door creaked open with surprising ease, revealing the dim interior. The cabin smelled of mold and damp wood, the air heavy with a musty, forgotten scent. The faint light from her flashlight cast long shadows across the room, revealing broken furniture and cracked windows. But what caught Samantha's attention was the fireplace, still intact, with dry wood piled neatly beside it. It was the first real warmth she had encountered in days. Relieved, she made her way inside, closing the door behind her. She quickly started a fire, the flames flickering and crackling, casting a soft glow that seemed to push back the oppressive darkness. As she sat beside the hearth, she began to relax, her stiff muscles slowly loosening. It felt like a safe haven, a moment of peace before the storm outside could consume her. But as the fire grew brighter, something strange began to happen. At first, it was a soft sound, almost imperceptible, like the distant hum of a voice. It was so faint that Samantha dismissed it as the wind outside. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder. It was a whisper, so low and unintelligible that it sent a chill down her spine. She stood up, her heart pounding. She moved cautiously toward the source of the sound, the walls of the cabin creaking with every step. The whispering seemed to be coming from the far corner of the room, near an old, rotting wardrobe. When she reached it, the whisper stopped abruptly. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as she cautiously opened the wardrobe door. Inside, there was nothing but the usual decay, old coats and forgotten belongings. But then she saw it, an old, tattered journal lay on the floor, its pages yellowed and brittle. The spine was cracked, and the cover was barely intact, as if it had been tossed aside and left to rot. She bent down to pick it up, feeling an odd sense of unease wash over her. The journal's pages were filled with hastily scrawled notes, written in a frantic, uneven hand. At first, the writing made no sense, but as she flipped through the pages, one sentence caught her attention. "The spirits will find you. They are watching, waiting to take you." Her pulse quickened, and she felt an ice-cold shiver race down her spine. She slammed the journal shut, her hands shaking. The whispering had returned, louder this time, filling her ears with voices too numerous to count. She could feel the eyes of unseen figures on her, their presence heavy in the room, their breath cold on her skin. The fire crackled and hissed, as if reacting to the unseen force that now surrounded her. The temperature in the cabin dropped suddenly, and Samantha's breath became visible, a mist of fog with each exhale. She backed toward the door, but as she did, She heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. Her eyes darted around the room, but there was no one there. The voices grew louder, more insistent. They weren't whispers anymore. They were calls, pleading for help, begging for release. Samantha's heart hammered in her chest as she sprinted toward the door. She threw it open, desperate to escape, but when she stepped outside, she froze. The storm had intensified, the snow now falling in thick sheets. The cabin, which had once been a beacon of safety, now felt like a prison, trapping her in the blinding white abyss of the wilderness. She turned to run, but the snow seemed to rise around her, as if the earth itself was closing in. In the distance, she could see figures, shadowy shapes moving toward her through the snowstorm, their forms shifting in and out of existence. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes empty, but their expressions were filled with despair. Samantha screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the storm. As the figures closed in, she realized too late that she was no longer alone. The spirits of those who had come before her, lost souls who had sought shelter in the cabin, only to never leave, were now reaching out to claim her as one of their own. The storm raged on, but Samantha's screams were lost to the wind. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the glowing eyes of the spirits, their faces twisted in agony. And then nothing. No one ever found Samantha. The cabin in the snow remains abandoned, lost to the wilderness, and those who wander too close speak of hearing a faint echo, an indistinct cry for help, a voice lost to time and tragedy. And the storm, it never truly ends. It had been weeks since Samantha vanished. Her disappearance now a chilling reminder to the locals of the unforgiving and haunted Alaskan wilderness. Yet, in the silence of the empty cabin, the memory of her screams lingered like the wind itself, carried across the snow-covered mountains and into the hearts of those who dared to remember. One evening, as the storm subsided and a rare stillness fell over the snow-covered landscape, a lone traveler named Ethan found himself in the vicinity of the cabin. He had been trekking across the same mountains for days, searching for an old hunting ground to photograph for his nature documentary. Ethan was no stranger to the wild. He had spent years in remote corners of the world, photographing the untouched beauty of the most desolate places on earth. But this time, something was different. The snowstorm that had made his journey treacherous was a mere shadow of the one that had claimed Samantha. Yet the stillness of the mountain seemed off, unnatural. The wind had died down almost completely, and the world was eerily quiet, save for the crunch of his boots in the snow. He had heard the stories of the cabin, whispers that floated on the wind, but dismissed them as nothing more than superstition. There were no ghosts in the mountains. There were only the harsh realities of nature and the creatures that roamed beneath the ice and snow. But as Ethan moved deeper into the wilderness, the thought of shelter before the nightfall began to weigh heavily on his mind. He had lost track of time and was unsure whether he could make it to his destination before dark. He needed warmth. It wasn't long before the twisted silhouette of the cabin emerged through the trees. Ethan paused for a moment, his breath catching his throat as he took in the sight. The cabin, now buried deeper in snow, looked even more abandoned and forgotten than he had imagined. Its wooden frame was partially swallowed by the earth, its windows darkened, obscured by layers of frost. The door, however, was slightly ajar. Ethan hesitated for a moment. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and the cabin's forlorn appearance made his instincts tingle. Still, the storm clouds were gathering once again, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. He couldn't afford to waste time. He pulled his coat tighter and moved toward the door. As he entered, the familiar smell of mildew and rot filled his nostrils. The interior was as disheveled as he expected. Broken furniture, faded wallpaper peeling from the walls. Dust covered every surface, and the silence was almost deafening. But something else was there, something that felt wrong. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, as though they were stretching, waiting. The air had the dense, suffocating quality that only the coldest places could provide. Ethan set down his bag, feeling the weight of his fatigue pressing on him. He turned to survey the cabin's contents, the faint light from his flashlight dancing across the decay. Nothing particularly alarming caught his eye, just the remnants of a forgotten life. Then he noticed it. In the far corner of the cabin, Behind an old dresser and half hidden in shadow was something, or rather, someone. At first, Ethan thought it was simply a trick of the light, or perhaps a forgotten pile of clothing. But as his gaze sharpened, he realized with a jolt that it was a figure, a person, a man, sitting slumped against a wall, his eyes wide open and staring into nothing. His face was gaunt, pale, and covered in frost. His clothes were old, tattered, stained with something dark. And most disturbing of all, his skin seemed unnaturally stiff, as though frozen mid-motion. Ethan took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. His instincts screamed at him to run, to turn and leave immediately, but something compelled him to investigate. He slowly approached the man's lifeless form, bending down to get a closer look. His hands trembled, and he instinctively reached out to check for any signs of life. But the man's body was cold, unnaturally so. A sudden rush of panic gripped him, and he backed away quickly, his mind racing. He had no idea how long the man had been here, or whether anyone else had found him before, but his presence only deepened the unsettling atmosphere of the cabin. It was as though the man had been waiting for someone to find him. Ethan's gaze swept around the room, as if looking for an escape, but his eyes fell once again on the corner of the cabin. This time, something caught his attention. A journal. It lay half buried beneath a pile of old blankets, its cover cracked and yellowed with age. He swallowed hard before picking it up, running his fingers along its fragile pages. The handwriting inside was messy, frantic, as though the writer had been desperate to get something out before it was too late. We are trapped. They are here. The spirits, they never leave. I tried to escape, but the snow, they won't let me go. They won't let me leave. The words blurred before his eyes as a shiver ran down his spine. His heart skipped a beat as he flipped through the pages, filled with similar cryptic entries. Some spoke of the cabin itself, how it was alive, feeding on the souls of those who entered. Others mentioned the Watcher, a figure that would never let anyone leave, its gaze following them wherever they went. Ethan's mind raced, but before he could process what he was reading, he heard it, a faint sound, almost too soft to hear at first. A tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. It echoed through the cabin, so faint at first that Ethan thought it was just the wind. But it came again, louder this time, from behind him. He spun around. The man in the corner, the one who had been dead, was gone. His stomach lurched. Ethan's pulse quickened, and his breath caught in his throat. He could feel it now, the presence that had been lingering just beyond his awareness. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened. The air turned colder, and the silence seemed to press in on him, growing heavier with each passing second. A faint whisper reached his ears, so quiet that he wasn't sure if he was imagining it. "Leave, before it's too late." It was the voice of a woman, weak, terrified, but unmistakably real. It was a voice that begged for help, but held a hidden warning. And Ethan realized then that the cabin was not a place to seek refuge, but a tomb, a trap for the unwary, where those who ventured inside never left. He turned, desperately grabbing his things, but as he reached the door, it slammed shut on its own. The room grew impossibly cold. The fire in the fireplace flickering out as if it were never there to begin with. The whispers grew louder, now voices from all directions, an incoherent cacophony that filled his head with dread. The walls began to close in, the shadows moving, shifting, twisting into shapes that did not belong to this world. And then he saw it, the Watcher, a figure standing in the doorway, its face obscured by the shadows, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was taller than a man, its form distorted and monstrous, its limbs elongated and unnaturally still. The eyes seemed to pierce through him, freezing him in place, and its mouth, if it could be called a mouth, twisted into a grin that wasn't human. Ethan took a step back, his breath shallow and frantic. But before he could flee, the Watcher reached out, its long fingers wrapping around his throat. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the faint glint of reflection in the cabin's cracked mirror. The faces of the spirits trapped here, their hollow eyes locked onto him, their cold mouths open in silent screams. The storm raged on through night, burying the cabin beneath layers of snow. No one would find Ethan's body. No one would come looking for him. He had joined the others, lost, forgotten souls who wandered the cabin forever. And so the cycle continued. The spirits watched. They waited. And the cabin would always claim those who were foolish enough to seek refuge within its walls. It had been years since the last of the mountain folk spoke of the cursed cabin, and the memory of its horrors began to fade from the town's collective consciousness. Life continued as usual in the nearby village, a small cluster of log cabins nestled near the edge of the wilderness. Yet, for those who had ventured close to the cabin in the stormy season, the stories of what lay within still lingered, warning them to stay away from the snowbound wilderness. Among the few who had heard the legends of the cabin, there was one man who refused to believe the whispers. His name was Jacob, a seasoned hiker who had been in the mountains countless times. Jacob had grown up with the stories of the haunted cabin, but to him, they were nothing more than old wives' tales meant to scare the weak-hearted. He was a man of logic and reason, and as winter approached once again, he saw it as nothing more than another opportunity to explore the rugged terrain. He had heard rumors of a once-in-a-lifetime view from the peak he had planned to climb, a place so remote that it was untouched by human footfall. The thought of standing on that summit, gazing over miles of untouched wilderness, thrilled him beyond measure, and so he set out, determined to conquer the wild. But as his journey took him further into the heart of the mountains, the weather grew more unpredictable. The winds picked up, the temperature plummeted, and snow began to fall in thick sheets. Still, Jacob pressed on, convinced that he could handle whatever the mountain threw at him. He knew the terrain well, and had spent years preparing for conditions like this. Yet, as night began to fall, and the storm showed no sign of letting up, Jacob found himself lost. His compass had stopped working, and the snowstorm had obscured all the familiar landmarks. In his frustration, he remembered the old stories of the cabin, the one that had claimed so many lives over the years. His breath came in ragged gasps as the cold bit into him. His mind was clouded with the fear of being caught in the storm overnight. The realization struck him suddenly, and despite his earlier skepticism, he found himself recalling the tales. The cabin was nearby, wasn't it? If he could find it, he might survive the storm, just for one night. It wasn't long before he saw it, just a silhouette in the distance. The roof sagged under the weight of the snow, the windows dark, and the door ajar. He approached cautiously, his heart racing in his chest as his eyes locked on the desolate building. There was the infamous cabin. Just for the night, he muttered to himself, tried to push away the sense of unease creeping up his spine. As he stepped inside, the air grew colder. The walls groaned as though the building itself was alive, responding to his presence. The smell of rotten decay filled his nose, and Jacob gagged. The space inside was empty, save for the remnants of broken furniture and dust-covered remnants of a time long forgotten. A fireplace in the corner remained cold, untouched by a flame in years. Yet Jacob felt something tugging at his thoughts, an unshakable sensation that this place was not what it seemed. He shook the feeling off and dropped his bag, deciding that a night by the fire would be enough to warm his body and clear his mind. But as he prepared to start the fire, a faint noise caught his attention. It was a soft, rustling sound, coming from the far side of the room. A door stood ajar, leading into another part of the cabin that appeared to be even darker than the rest. Jacob frowned and moved closer to investigate. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing a small room. The walls were covered in layers of frost, and the floorboards creaked beneath his feet. But what caught his attention was what lay in the center of the room, an old rocking chair. The chair sat eerily still at first, but as Jacob watched, the chair began to rock ever so slightly. It wasn't the wind, as the storm outside raged louder than ever. And it wasn't a draft. It was as if something was sitting in the chair. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his breath caught in his throat. "Okay, maybe I'm just tired," he muttered to himself. "Just need some rest." But as he turned to leave the room, something changed. The temperature in the cabin dropped, and Jacob could see his breath fogging in front of him. The door slammed shut behind him, and the whispers began. Low at first, they sounded like faint murmurs, coming from all corners of the cabin. Jacob's heart began to race, his eyes darting around, but no one was there. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice quivering with growing panic. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Words began to form, frantic, pleading words. "Leave now, don't stay, you're next." He backed away slowly, his thoughts a blur of fear and confusion. His body was trembling, and his mind screamed at him to flee. But before he could make it to the door, something caught his eye. The journal, the tattered journal that had belonged to the previous victims, its cover worn and fragile. It sat on the floor near the rocking chair, waiting for him to discover it. Unable to resist, Jacob approached the journal with shaking hands. He opened it, the pages brittle under his fingers, and there, scrawled on the first page, was a sentence that made his stomach turn. "The Watcher is always watching. He will never let you leave." Jacob slammed the journal shut, his heart pounding in his chest. He stumbled back toward the door, but as he reached for the handle, the room plunged into complete darkness. A gust of wind howled through the cracks in the cabin, extinguishing his flashlight and leaving him in pitch-black silence. And then he heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably close. His breath caught in his throat, and he spun around, but no one was there. "Who's there?" he shouted again, his voice hoarse with fear. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a chilling silence. The air was thick with dread, and the only sound was his own heartbeat, pounding in his ears. Suddenly, a figure appeared before him, a tall, dark silhouette in the darkness. Jacob's eyes widened in horror as the figure stepped forward, its glowing eyes fixing on him with an unnatural intensity. The Watcher. It stood there, towering over him, its twisted, gaunt form emitting an overwhelming sense of malevolence. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, and its hollow eyes gleamed with the knowledge of some unspeakable truth. Jacob could feel his body freeze, his limbs stiffening as the figure stepped closer. He wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't move. His legs refused to obey him, rooted to the spot as the Watcher loomed over him. The whispers filled his mind. Screams of agony, pleas for help, the tortured souls trapped within this place. "Please." Jacob managed to gasp, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean to intrude." The Watcher's grin widened, its cold breath washing over him like a wave of ice. It raised its hand, and the room seemed to close in on Jacob, the walls pressing in around him. He could feel the spirits of the cabin reaching out, their cold fingers brushing against him, dragging him closer to the darkness. And then, just as quickly as it began, it was over. The figure vanished, leaving Jacob alone in the suffocating silence. The storm outside continued to howl, but inside the cabin there was no sound. Jacob's breath came in ragged gasps, and he stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. He had escaped for now. But as he stumbled toward the door, his heart sank as he realized that the storm had worsened, and the world outside had become a swirling vortex of white. There was no escape. The cabin had claimed him. The Watcher would not let him leave, and as the door slammed shut behind him, Jacob's scream was swallowed by the wind, lost forever in the snow. The storm never stopped. The cabin stood in its place, hidden deep within the snow, its walls saturated with the suffering of those who had entered its grip. The spirits of the lost wandered its halls, forever trapped in the cold embrace of the Watcher. And with each passing year, the cycle continued, new victims, new stories, all claimed by the endless winter that seemed to feed on their souls. The Watcher waited, and the cabin watched. The winds howled once again to the jagged peaks of the mountains, their cold bite leaving nothing untouched by frost. It was a familiar sound for those who had lived near the snow-covered wilderness for years. But for those who ventured too far, it signaled something far darker, something ancient, something unyielding. For the past few months, the small town nestled near the mountains had been quiet. Too quiet. People who once frequented the mountain trails now avoided them, too afraid of what lingered there. But as winter's grip tightened, a new figure emerged, a woman named Maya. Maya was a journalist, a writer with a passion for uncovering the truth, no matter how dark it might be. She had heard rumors of the cabin, whispers of people who had gone missing, of a cursed place in the mountains where no one returned. But Maya didn't believe in ghosts or curses. She believed in stories, and the cabin was a story she was determined to tell. She arrived in town in late November, just as the first heavy snowstorms rolled in. With her camera, notebook, and a steely resolve, Maya made her way to the local diner, where the few remaining residents gathered for warmth and conversation. Looking for something in particular? An old man asked as Maya sat down at the counter, a cup of coffee in her hands. "Stories," she replied with a smile. "I've heard there's a cabin up in the mountains, a place people disappear. Any truth to that?" The old man's face went pale. He turned away, muttering something under his breath, and the other patrons at the bar went silent. Maya could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't flinch. "It's a cursed place," another man, much younger, spoke up. His voice was low, like he didn't want anyone to hear him. "Some folks say it's alive, that the snow, the storm, the watcher, it all changes you. Changes you." Maya asked, intrigued. The man hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "No one's come back from that cabin. Not in a long time. And those who tried, well, they don't come back the same." Maya's curiosity only deepened. She knew it would be dangerous. She knew she might be pushing the limits of sanity. But her hunger for the truth outweighed the warnings of the locals. There was a story to be uncovered, and she would uncover it. By the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, Maya had made up her mind. She would hike out to the cabin at first light. It didn't matter what anyone said or how eerie the warnings might seem. She was ready to confront whatever lay hidden within the snow-covered wilderness. But what Maya didn't know was that the cabin, its dark secrets, its history of torment, was ready for her too. The morning came in a wash of gray, the clouds heavy in the sky, promising snow. Maya dressed warmly in layers, her breath visible in the crisp air as she shouldered her backpack and left the warmth of the diner behind. The mountain paths were already slick with ice, and the wind bit at her cheeks. But nothing would stop her from reaching the cabin. She had to see it for herself. The climb was steep, and the wind picked up as she ascended higher into the mountains. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she struggled against the biting cold, her boots crunching to the thick blanket of snow. The further she went, the quieter the world seemed to become. The only sound was the rhythmic creak of the snow beneath her and the occasional rustle of branches as they bowed under the weight of the snow. But something about the silence made Maya uneasy. As the hours passed, the landscape around her became increasingly desolate. The trees thinned, leaving only the skeletal remains of branches clawing at the gray sky. The snow piled higher, and the wind howled, biting into her face. Yet, no matter how hard she pressed on, the feeling of being watched never left her. At one point, she stopped to rest on a fallen log, her breath coming in ragged bursts as she took a quick swig from her water bottle. She checked her map and her GPS, but nothing seemed to match up. She was off the trail, far deeper into the mountain range than she had intended to be. The storm had disoriented her, and now, she wasn't sure if she was anywhere near the cabin. A chill ran through her spine, and she felt a growing, unmistakable sensation that she wasn't alone. But when she looked over her shoulder, the snow was empty, only the bleak white landscape stretching out before her. Her fingers trembled as she gripped her camera, snapping a few photos of the hauntingly empty wilderness. Yet, in the distance through the snowstorm, she swore she saw something. A dark silhouette. The cabin. It was real. Maya pushed forward, her legs aching with exhaustion, but the sight of the cabin in the distance gave her renewed strength. It was just beyond a thick cluster of trees, barely visible through the falling snow. Her heart began to race with excitement. And something else. Something far less definable. As she approached the cabin, she could feel the cold seeping into her bones. The structure stood crookedly against the howling wind, its timbers darkened by age and neglect. The windows were obscured with layers of ice and snow, and the door, half open, creaked in the wind. It was a dark, imposing presence, standing like a sentinel in the storm. She stepped closer, her camera raised. But as soon as her foot touched the threshold, a strange feeling washed over her, a sense of dread that made her freeze in place. It was as if the cabin itself knew she was there, and it didn't welcome her. But Maya wasn't one to back down. Not now. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was cold and stale, and the faint smell of rot clung to everything. She stepped carefully into the dim interior, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and broken furniture was scattered across the floor. A faint sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the cabin, a faint creaking, like someone was moving in the next room. Maya's heart skipped a beat, but she steadied herself. It was probably just the wind. She could hear the storm raging outside, its ferocity amplifying the creaking of the old structure. Her flashlight swept across the room, illuminating a dusty old rocking chair in the corner. The same one that had been described in the journal. The same one that Ethan and countless others had seen. But it was empty. She moved forward, her boots crunching on the snow that had blown in through the broken windows. She found the journal near the chair just as Ethan had, its pages yellowed and torn. She flipped through it quickly, her eyes scanning the cryptic notes of those who had written before her. Each word was more frantic than the last. Warnings, cryptic pleas, references to the Watcher. A chill crawled up her spine. But as she read, a noise caught her ear, a soft, raspy breath, coming from the darkened corner of the room. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She slowly turned, but the rocking chair was now moving, slowly, gently, as if someone was sitting in it. The temperature in the cabin dropped, and Maya could see her breath fogging in the air. Her heart pounded in her chest. She was no longer alone. Out of the darkness, a shadowy figure began to materialize, a tall, emaciated form with hollow eyes that gleamed in the low light. The Watcher. It was watching her. As the storm finally subsided, the town remained unaware of the fate that had befallen Maya. No one would find her. Not now. Not ever. The Watcher waited for the next lost soul, and the cycle would continue. Forever. The end.